this one. So.
Well, we've got some people joining on Zoom. There's Paula and Ed and Diana so far.
The people on Zoom.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get started since we have a critical mass here. Turn on the microphone to make it official. Hello, welcome everybody. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great, good, okay. Well, thank you all for being here this evening to celebrate Nancy Wynen's publication of her first novel, We Did What We Could. Before we begin today's program, I would like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the ancestral territory of the Coast Salish people, in particular the Samish tribe, whose traditional territory stretches over a wide region of the Salish Sea, from the tops of the Cascade Mountains to the far western shores of the San Juan Islands. We are living, learning, writing, growing in a place that has been their home since time immemorial. And they are the original inhabitants of this land, which was taken by the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855 without adequate compensation. The Samish people are fishers, artists, storytellers, musicians, and harvesters of the natural abundance that this beautiful land and sea provide. And I'd like to thank the Coast Salish people for allowing us to inhabit this place and call it our home. I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Lopez Island Library for their generous support of all library programs. For example, this podium is new and was made possible by the Friends. So we love our friends, and if you're interested in getting more involved with them, you could talk to me or Darren, or Fonz is on the board also of the Friends. I wanted to mention, since we're here for a writing related thing, that the library is just beginning a new program in May, starting on the first Thursday. It's a writer's open mic night. So if anybody has some material they'd like to throw out there and share with their writing community, come on down to the library on the first Thursday at 5:30. Okay, and now for the reason we are here, let me quickly introduce tonight's author, Nancy Wynen. Nancy has lived on Lopez for 10 years with her husband, Fonz. She was vicar for the Grace Episcopal Church during that time and is now enjoying a busy retirement, which must include writing a novel. From her first full-time job in Columbia University's Oral History Department to a 5-year career as a librarian. 25.
Years right.
Woo, 25-year career. Well, that makes more sense. And then as an Episcopal priest, Nancy has been listening to people's personal stories, helping people with their research, and her own passion of studying history led to a desire to mix the stories she has heard with the facts of written history. And her novel puts this passion to the page. So please join me in congratulating and welcoming our author, Nancy Wynen.
Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. I'm really glad to see all of you here. And like Malia said, it's just been sort of a combination of listening, particularly to friends, family, listening to the stories about our parents' generation that made me focus on a novel for World War II. And I tried to narrow it down, but I'm a little bit ADD, so I just can't focus. So I have 3 main characters that I've given almost equal setting to, because I just couldn't choose one. And so the 3 girls that are the main characters not in the book, are three aspects of how people survived World War II. And there's Maggie, who they're all wealthy. They met in boarding school. They're all very, very smart, of course. You wouldn't have a dumb protagonist. You'd have to have somebody smart, right? And they were known for being real pranksters at school. And so how that would develop their lives during World War II, Maggie is somebody who has sort of a Downton Abbey kind of estate background. Ellie is the daughter of Dutch diplomats who are right now in London. Surprised that it's a Dutch family. And the third one is Agnes, whose family is wealthy through business, and their main house is in London. The three girls go in separate ways once they've graduated from boarding school. And so the stories are, what do they do through family connections to get where they are?
Yes.
And then on to the adventures of being in World War II. Maggie is immediately taken into the Battle of Britain with the RAF and the fighters. You know, we owe so much to so few. And she becomes a personal assistant to one of the air marshals, which is like a general in England. Agnes goes against her parents' wishes and becomes a nurse, goes to school in London and stays on, and actually is part of the hospital staff during the early Blitz from 40 to 41. The third girl, Ellie, goes back to the Netherlands where she re-meets a fellow that she's just known ever since they were very young, and she gets married pretty much right away. And so by 1940, when the Germans occupy the Netherlands, she already has a one-year-old, and her husband, who is a reserve army officer, winds up leaving because his life would be in danger, because the military officers would be the first line of resistance and patriotism. And so the military people had to escape rather than being put in some sort of concentration camp or detention camp. So the three girls go in their separate ways, but they keep seeing each other and meeting each other. Climax I won't tell you about, but it brings all three girls together again. So do you have any questions about where it goes?
Beautiful.
Well, it sounds really good, and I'm interested to read it.
So
It's part of my history too. My mother was in prison camp.
Oh, okay.
And I was born over there, and her history, my family's history, has really had a big effect, and especially recently because
It's okay.
their home was in Lvov, which is now Lviv,
Mhm.
part of Ukraine, and all this stuff that's going on. So,
It brings it right back again.
yeah.
A lot of the stories that I write are somewhat biographical because of just hearing different things from different people and wanting to put them together, including my parents-in-law and also friends of mine who were able to share some of their parents' stories with me as well. So I have a couple of passages, one for each girl, if you want me to go right ahead. Okay.
I'd like to get a flavor for them.
Okay. Now Maggie, the one who's with the RAF, the two things that you have to know in advance, she worked directly for a man named Hugh Dowding, who was the air marshal in charge of the fighter pilots. He was also very forward-thinking and did such marvelous things in the 1930s as pave air strips, because you can't really land and take off if it's muddy. And so just changing, airfields over to paved was one of his big things. The other thing that really takes place here in the story is what they called chain home system, which was a primitive sort of radar that relied on a series of towers all the way along the coast of southern England as well as eastern England. And the towers held radar kind of detection devices. And that was brought down to like a little hut near where those towers were. He hardwired each one of those towers or huts directly back to London where his headquarters was, so that there would be no breakage in communication. And very often it was just known as CH, chain home. And so one of the things that she does is she coordinates her work with the chain home operators at the various huts. And I think I better have my glasses. Or not. No, here we are.
Oh my gosh, did you see that look?
We all saw it.
No comments from
That's also an inheritance from my grandmother, who my mother copied quite well. Okay. This is August of 1940, right in the middle of the major part of the Battle of Britain. Sergeant Carter, Maggie called out into the maintenance building. Collect 10 meal rations and all your equipment. You have 20 minutes. Less than 20 minutes later, he was back, ready at the motor pool entrance. Maggie drove her blue MG convertible out of the garage, and they started packing up their car. And Cotter said, "Your automobile?" And she nodded yes. Civilian cover is better than official-looking staff cars or armored trucks for safety and speed. We don't want to be obvious from overhead. They packed everything in a large box at the back of the car, and off they went. Cotter said, "I heard that in addition to the 4 CH station huts that were destroyed, some of the operators were killed or wounded today. All the more reason why I'm making this personal visit. At least all the towers survived with minor damage. All the stations have to be fully back up by tomorrow. Pevensey and Rye say that they can fix the immediate problems themselves, but Dover and Moore Hill need those new machines we have." Moore Hill. Here, we are at my favorite station. Maggie said this as she parked. "Hello, Mert. Are you and Phil all right?" "Right as rain, as always," Mert said. "Time for tea?" "After we find out what needs repairing," said Maggie. I'm skipping so that we can stay with the story. There are lots of little bylines. As Cotter finished connecting the new machines, Phil noticed the closest tower. Several support struts were bent, broken, or missing. Cotter saw that there was a break in the transmission cable about 60 feet above ground. It's an easy splice, he judged. He grabbed a coil of cable wire, tape, rubber tubing, pliers, and wire cutters, and jogged over to the tower. "Watch out for that hole," came the shout, just as Cotter fell into it. A second shout came from Cotter himself as he writhed in pain. Maggie and Mert ran to him. "I think it's just a sprain," he said through gritted teeth. Mert and Maggie helped Cotter limp to a chair. "We'll have to get someone else from town to climb that tower," Mert said. "No time for that," Maggie heard herself saying. Turning to Cotter, she said, "Can I do the repair? We have to get back to North Holt before the blackout starts." Cotter studied the broken cable in the tower. A temporary fix at best. The cable snapped right next to the tower ladder, and the ends are still attached to the tower above and below the break. Just 2 wires inside tubing, not complex like telephone cables. You can do it. Cotter quickly showed her how to make the splice. With no time to think, Maggie started up the ladder. Heights were her private terror. At home, she barely managed to climb into the hayloft of the horse barn, and that was only a 9-step ladder. This one must be over 100 steps to the broken strut. To make it even worse, she started asking herself, what if there were still stray enemy planes in the air? What if I fall? What if? What if? She shut off her mind and concentrated on what needed to be done. All the way up, she kept repeating, "This is for you, Andrew, my love. This is for you." Oh, and the rest of the pilots as well. She was there. She reached the high dangling cable. Grab it, trim away the old tubing, twist the old black wire with the new black wire sticking out of the cable in my belt. Wrap the twist with tape. Repeat on the red to red. Tape over the whole repair. Go down the ladder to the other end of the break. Do everything again. Done. Maggie began backing down the rest of the ladder. She kept whispering, "Oh God, oh God, oh God," until she reached the ground. When she stepped away from the tower, her knees did not want to work. She just stood there for a few minutes, pretending to study her handiwork until she regained the use of her muscles. Right, time for that tea. And perhaps a quick bite to eat, and then we're off. It wasn't as casual as she wanted to sound, but her three comrades stared quietly and nodded. They opened some of the meals they brought and ate quickly. Maggie and Cotter promised to send a welding crew out for the next day to repair the broken strut and make a more permanent repair to the wire. With that promise, they drove back to Uxbridge, Northolt, and Bentley Priory. Yeah, when they got back to Uxbridge, Maggie drove Cotter over to the hospital and then parked her car in the motor pool. She had to report in. The command room was there with colored pins on maps all over the walls, showing airfields and radar stations that were damaged. Maggie gasped. Every installation had damage pins, many labeled high damage. The faces of the people in the room were drawn. All day, calls had reported loss after loss. The CH stations gave the flyers the advantage against the much larger German Air Force, but the losses of runways, pilots, and planes, even temporarily, were reaching not just critical, but tragic levels. "Ah, Shelford," the chief of the chain home radio operations commented. "Nice work today." "We heard that you saved the day, Officer Shelford," remarked a bemused senior officer trying to lighten the grim mood. He annoyed everyone with his attempts at being cheerful. "And taking a jolly ramp in your MG convertible. I want your assignment." "You may not find it to your liking," Maggie replied. Military humor was often ghoulish, but right now she was too tired to put up with it. She looked around the room. "This office reminds me of my father's game room. He plays the Battle of Waterloo with his little toy soldiers. You play with these pins in much the same way. If you'd like to be target practice for the Germans, sir, I would suggest you do it in a military vehicle like the ones we saw flipped over on our way. At least I wasn't an obvious target, and I didn't wind up as a casualty of war." With that, she left. She knew that she'd gone too far, losing her composure in front of the brass. "My less than brilliant military career is definitely over," she thought as she went across the room. She had one more stop, reporting to Air Marshal Dowding. "Ah, Maggie, well done," he said as she entered his Spartan office. "I heard that all the stations are running again, with no small credit to your own personal action." "Oh?" "Moore Hill called in as soon as you left. Chief Officer Fenwick gave us the story of your marvelous repair job. Bravo." He gave an unusual and brief half smile before becoming serious again. "Right. On the other hand, it's a serious breach of military conduct for a low-ranking volunteer office to berate any officer, especially senior rank. Well deserved, perhaps, but not acceptable. Meanwhile, I need you to call early tomorrow morning. Time to go to London." "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," she said. "Still in uniform then? 12 hours from now." She started to turn and leave. Another thing, Dowding's face was without expression. "Find a way to wear trousers from now on when you're in the field." That's Maggie.
Oh, that's cute. That's cute.
She's one of those people who can do anything she's asked to do, and she doesn't even think about it. her parents wanted her and her brothers to be self-sufficient enough to be able to cope with life after World War I, when so many people did not return from the war. It meant that men and women had to pick up the slack. And so she was just assumed that she could do anything that was expected of her. And so since she never got any praise, she just went ahead and did stuff. And so that's how she got through climbing the tower.
Wow.
She goes on to being fortunately for the writer in me, soon after the war, the Battle of Britain was finished at the end of the summer of 1940, he had to retire because he didn't play good politics, which gave me a chance to move her on to something else, which turned out to be military journalism later on. But yeah, that's Maggie. So it's fun to try and figure out some of these characters. I'm an only child, so I have a lot of imaginary friends and they've just joined the group. So, did you want to hear about the other two?
Yes,
Please.
You sure? Okay. Just so happens I'm ready. Okay, occupied Netherlands, 1941, late 1941. Okay. Every house had their system to survive Nazi occupation. On this day, Dora, who was a servant, was the first to leave the Van Horn household. She was an expert at getting food using the 7 ration back books allowed to them as a start. She tried to be the first in the first group of shoppers at any given store. She paid, bargained, and traded for whatever was available. Very serious and tough, she made sure her family was fed. She cheerfully went marketing and made friends among the other shoppers. She listened to each day's gossip, who was taken by the Germans, which areas were damaged or destroyed by bomb raids, and what were the latest rule changes. Of course, the Van Horns listened to the news on their hidden radio, but Dora never let on. She usually traded fluffy information, but it kept her in the loop for more important news. She passed on everything to the professor. Today, the friendly policeman warned the shoppers of a razzia, a roundup of members of the resistance or any men who could be sent to Germany for factory work. One of those would be happening this evening. The second person out of the house was Ellie. She placed Wim in the seat of her theater wagon. She planned to tell the story of Cinderella, handing out roles of fairy godmothers and dancers at the ball to the children at the nursery school. Ellie also did minor work for the local resistance movement. She passed information from school parents and teachers to the professor and supplied some of Peter's chemicals, that's her husband, Peter's chemicals to his former students who created inks for counterfeit documents. Working with the chemicals made it feel like Peter was still around. Professor Willems was the third person to leave the house. 3 days each week, he rode the bus to the prison where he gave his required educational lectures to the prisoners and exchanged information with resistance leaders that were being held there. He sent on the information from them as well as Dora, Ellie, and Gran, Ellie's grandmother, to the next level of people. The kindly, genteel, retired professor was not part of the local resistance. He had other ways of getting his news to the right place. Just as the family sat down to dinner, later that day, there was a knock on the door. Too early for the razzia and too late for friends and neighbors to stop by, Mr. Brinker opened the door, and in walked, no, paraded, Ben DeWeaver. Ellie looked at her youngest brother in disgust. His NSB uniform was so out of place in her house. How he could be a member of the Dutch pro-Nazi paramilitary was shocking, sad, and fearful all at the same time. Hello, dear sister, he beamed. I'm in town and thought I'd stop by for a bite to eat. Hello, she said in her most proper manner. We don't have much, due to the rationing imposed by your friends. In fact, our best produce, I hear, is being stolen and sent to Germany. But since you're family, we'll give you something. Without so much as a thank you, Ben sat down at the head of the table. Gran said nothing, but was visibly angry. No one said anything to him or dared look him in the eye. Ben carried on a one-sided conversation about all the wonderful things the Germans were doing. He tried successfully to make friends with his little nephew, Wim. The meal, though meager, dragged on for seemingly hours. No one responded to him with more than 2 or 3 words at a time. To his credit, Wim sensed the mood in the room and did not react to Ben. The atmosphere was tense. I think the 3 of you, Ellie said to the Brinkers and Dora, I think you should take Wim to see the Poldermans next door. They may have some extra fruit we can use for dessert. They nodded, stood up, and taking Wim by the hand, left. Why are you really here, Ben? Ellie asked, both hands flat on the table. There's a razzia tonight, and I thought I might warn my favorite sister, Ben offered. His friendliness was obviously false. Ellie was very close to losing her temper. Well, we should be all safe, Ellie replied. No one here is eligible. What about Peter? Ben's smile was fading. I would think that he might be worried about being picked up. Ellie's hands became fists, which she slammed on the table as she stood up quickly. That's enough, she shouted. We haven't seen Peter for a full year. You know that. I have asked you to use your connections to find him and the authorities in town. A lot of good that's been. Fine and marvelous German administration. A year and still no news. He's lost in your bureaucratic system that's supposed to be so great. The room was silent. Ben had never seen his sister this angry. Maybe he went underground and escaped? Peter? Ellie looked bewildered and her voice was high-pitched. Peter, the non-adventuresome professor? Taking on such a daring trip? Hardly. He can't remember to put money in his pocket for lunch. Ellie's voice grew louder, her face redder. He went missing that day when the university was shut down. How many people were sent away that day? How many have not been accounted for? Ben, think. Hardly anyone was planning to leave back then. We were trying just to learn to adjust to the occupation and live day by day. Admit it. Your German friends lost Peter in some paper jungle. You want Peter? You have him. You find him. Ellie was shouting without taking a breath. Gran, Professor Willems, and Ben stared at Ellie. This was not the Ellie they knew. No one had ever seen her lose her temper or show anger. She had never raised her voice, let alone shout. Ellie herself was surprised at the outburst. She used her total concentration to stay calm for the sake of all of the rest of them. Then, out of the corner of an eye, she felt like she was on stage at school. Lady Macbeth's mad scenes all over again. Well, she thought, my real emotions are better than Lady M's, whose evil and guilty words came from a different set of emotions. I better speed this up, though. Ben has got to leave and fast before little Wim and the others come back. Get out of the house now, Ben, and don't ever come back. Ellie walked towards him and got as close to him as she could. She was nearly hysterical as she added, go back to your new friends. No wonder they took you into the NSB. You're not even civil to your own family. Do not ever come back here. This is not your house, and you will never be welcome. Ben was so startled that he backed up in fear that she might do herself and him harm. He tried to regain his composure. He looked at Gran, who was equally angry, turned, and left the house. Just be careful, all of you, he said, reining in his anger and discomfort. Ellie stepped forward and closed the door. She paused, her head leaning against the wooden doorframe. She turned around, visibly shaken, and said, I hope he got the message. I can never do that again. Well, maybe if Peter was involved. Gran came to her and gave her a hug. Professor Willem patted her on the shoulder. No sooner had they begun to breathe normally again that the door opened and Dora, the Brinkers, and Wim entered. Dora noticed the contorted face of the three people in the sitting room. Unsure of what had happened, except that Ben was gone, Dora asked, "We waited until he left. What happened?" "Not tonight," Gran answered. "Just know that Ben is no longer welcome here." Mrs. Brinker and Dora cleaned up the leftover dishes. Dora bravely asked, "Is he disowned because of his politics?" "Something like that."
Something like that.
So she's got a different thing. She's the one that's sort of like the daydreamer. If you think when I said that they like to play practical jokes, it was usually Ellie who's the dreamer. She was the multilingual person, the theater lady. She would dream something up. And then Agnes, who we haven't met yet, she is the scientist, medical person. She's got the more analytical mind. She figures out how it's going to work. Maggie's the one who actually follows through and does it. And that's how the three of them operate.
Got that.
Yeah, and so Ellie is the sweetie. So for her to come out of her background, except for theater, to just explode at her brother is really a big deal. Now that some of those stories were actually part of what I learned about my own, about Fonz's parents. My father-in-law was a physical education teacher, but a reserve Army officer. And so he really did have to escape because all the military men were being rounded up, all those with officer training. And he just, at the very beginning of the war, they were rounded up. It was too much of a logistical nightmare, so they were sent home just told, be good. And then as the war progressed, they were starting to be called back in, and my father-in-law said, nope, and he escaped to England. So in the story, I have Peter reenacting my father-in-law's journey to England. And that I got actually from his own, he wrote out his own autobiography for the family. And I was able to use some of the detail from that to help flesh out the story. So, but a lot of families were just so divided because of that. But very few, I would say a very, very small amount of the Dutch population turned out to be Nazi sympathizers. What do you think?
Yeah.
Pretty small.
Yeah, small.
Yeah.
What happened to the Nazi sympathizers after the war? They assimilated.
Will you repeat the question, Nancy, for the?
Yeah. What happened to the Nazi sympathizers after World War II?
The head of the NSB, the National Socialist Movement, he was executed. Yes. One and only one. That was executed. And right after that, they abolished the death penalty. A lot of them went to jail for a relatively short period of time. But yeah, they got rounded up. The higher up you were, the longer the jail term.
Yeah, there were quite a few Nazi sympathizers in England too.
Yeah, I tried to avoid too much of the stuff that was happening in England. There was a lot of stuff that I did incredible amounts of research and then just sort of let it sit there in my brain for a while and then tried to work it out with my friends to figure out how much of it was really important to them. And there was just so much information that you really had to think, how much would the average person have really known at any given time during the war as well as, and not a lot, yeah. So that, there was a lot of wartime censorship. And I have in Maggie's story as a journalist, she experiences one of the really horrific post-horrific battles in the northern part of France after D-Day. And the photograph that she sees in a book shows everybody cheering and laughing and dancing down the street. And she knows like half-mile away was one of these really horrendous massacre debacle kind of things. And she understands that you do have to have a certain amount of censorship to keep your own information and your information sources safe. And you don't want the public to be completely grossed out.
Demoralized.
Yeah. And so there are a couple of places in the book where I have the idea that journalists may actually have two diaries, one for their publication and one hopefully posterity 10 years down the road, but that you really, certain things never happened because of the way people just are. So, but it was interesting. A lot of our friends in the Netherlands especially were very eager to share their stories. The last piece that I want to read aloud, if you let me, has to do with how I took real stories and mixed them together. One of my girlfriends had, her father was a flyer, a bomber pilot in Germany, and he was brought home to train up new pilots. Well, that's great. And he decided to contact his fiancée and said, as long as I'm stateside, let's get married. And so she said yes, and her family came to whatever base he was at, training up these pilots, and they had their wedding. And his student squadron decided to buzz the church and the reception. Next thing you know, he, as the instructor, and the whole squadron are thrown in the brig for a week.
Are what?
Are thrown in the brig for a week
Oh,
for, misuse of government property or who knows what. So I had to file that in the back of my mind.
oh, that's a real part.
That's a real true story right from the daughter's mouth, right? So, I mean, it's family lore. It's wonderful fun. And so, of course, her mom was alone with her parents and sister in the honeymoon suite because he saw the brig. So then a friend of mine here in the United States said, well, do you know about the beer spits? And I went, what? It turns out that if you know anything about the British Navy, they always have their grog.
Yes.
They've got us, and so the Army is not going to be outdone. And so they have their own drinks that are supplied more or less officially. And so here's after D-Day, the British Army, the American Army, they're crossing the northern coast of France towards Germany. And they're expecting their stuff, their libations. So what do? But they bring in on these very short runways that are set up right away after each battle has been, done. They use the Spitfires, which are the fighter planes, and they've been tying beer kegs under the wings right up against the fuselage and bringing them into the front lines.
Oh, my God.
So I got to use that too.
Sounds good.
So that will be Agnes's story. If you want me to go
A
ahead.
little bit, yeah.
Now remember, she's the scientist. She went against her family to get into nursing school. She's very instinctive about her medicine. And her family has a business of tea and spices. And that's very important to this too. Well, girls, please explain what's been happening from the beginning. Nurse Squadron Leader Rambleton demanded. You two, nurses trained at St. Bart's and St. Thomas. You would think that the premier nursing schools in London would have produced better qualified professionals. She snorted. Agnes spoke up. Our supplies ran out and we needed to do something. We had these boys to take care of. When that last convoy was destroyed by the Germans, we had no choice. We had to improvise. First, said Rambleton, no more taking table legs from civilians for splints. That's stealing from the locals, even if they have no use for table legs without a table. The same with bed linens. Second, no more leaving wounds open to the air or covering them in tea bags. Third, no more using brandy as a disinfectant. I'm not going on, she said. Ma'am, Vera said with some quiet confidence, growing up as a Girl Guide in Canada, I learned a lot of forest survival skills, including first aid. I searched for anything that was the right size for splints, and the bed sheets were used for tying the splints together, not to close any open wounds. Agnes knew about using tea to prevent infection, so we used some of her collection. Keeping wounds open until proper surgery could be performed was our choice based on what was happening. We had to consider the high risk of infection, Agnes ventured, because a farmer had hidden those soldiers in his barn before they came to us. The dirt floor was, well, not very sanitary, what with cows and horses standing by. I didn't want to close the wound while it might be so unsterile. I wrote that on the airman's tag so that the docs back home could understand. And your attempt at being me, pretending to be a full commanding officer matron by taking and wearing my jacket? Fully guilty, Agnes admitted. I was just so angry at the whole war and not getting our supplies when the first convoy got hit. She raised her head and looked defensively, but not contrite. Nevertheless, it worked. We had our supplies by nightfall. Now, in your favor, said the matron, both of you are quite calm under stress. I guess working in London made you both more battle ready than I thought. And your creative skills, regardless of how you got them, are, after all is said, quite useful in wartime. Nurses need to ignore military protocols to get on with the job at hand. Honestly, I might have done the same thing. With no further ado, I am making battlefield promotions for both of you. Now, let's get to the pub. So we go to the pub.
Well, they go to the pub.
Gotta go to the pub. Well, to celebrate their new promotions. The beer spitz is here, they heard as they approached the bar. The men were cheering and running towards the runway. Agnes looked over at the airstrip. There, at the end of the runway, turning around and setting up for the return flight, was a Spitfire Supermarine. Under each wing was strapped securely next to the fuselage a large keg of beer. Agnes had heard of this, the British military's official, unofficial ration of grog or beer delivered to the fronts of battles. She suspected that most of the beer was delivered by truck, but in France they were using planes. The ground crew detached the kegs and rolled them towards the new pub. The pilot took off his leather helmet and Agnes stared in disbelief. It was Stan Novak. She slowly walked towards him in a trance, not wanting to take her eyes off him. She was afraid that he might disappear. Soldiers and airmen swarmed him, the hero of the day. They backed off to give him some room to walk to the pub, and just before he entered, he turned his head and saw her. His reaction was the same as Agnes. He froze and stared at her. His face was hard to read, but he slowly turned his whole body and started towards her. They met and stared at each other for a moment. Then they hugged each other. I can't breathe, Agnes gasped as she tried to get released. When she stepped back, she saw that Stan was crying just as she was. Hello. Hello. I don't know what to say. Neither do I. Okay, called one of the pilots. So you know each other. Now, as delivery pilot, tap our lifeline so we can quench our thirst. These were the first wooden kegs, and what they contained better be better than what's been coming out of those cleaned fuel tanks. Wow. It was as much a threat as a prayer. The movement of the crowd pushed them both into the pub. Stan stepped forward to do the honor of tapping the keg. Traditions, no matter how new, had to be followed. Now, Stan is a Polish pilot and I wrote most of his dialogue in awkward English because his English just was never all that great. Stan then took Agnes's hand and led her out of the pub looking for someplace private. They found a stack of unopened crates and sat there, not ready to say anything. Too many memories and emotions. Where would they even begin? Finally, Stan spoke. Why are you here? Agnes explained that after Jan died, his older brother, she did the best thing that she could to live up to his name and became one of the members of the Princess Mary's Air Force Nursing Corps. And you, no more fighting? Temporary duty, Stan explained. Punishment. I am veteran pilot. Not many like me after 5 years in Sky. I am now squadron leader, mix of Polish and English. We speak good English now and fight in same squadrons. Then group captain gets married. We have big party. We fly low over house and church to celebrate wedding. Group captain likes, but boss is very angry. He demands all squadron in jail for 2 days, then off normal duty for 1 month. Pilots still needed, so we fly not so important missions like beer. Jail also for group captain, no honeymoon. So I deliver beer to Army and RAF. We have longer runways now, so next time bigger planes with more supplies that change to hospital evac on return. I qualify in all airplanes now. You miss John? You still miss Jan? All the time. She pulled out her necklace with Jan's pendant. Stan nodded in approval, smiling and serious at the same time. So what now? Agnes asked. Get through war and see, said Stan. And you? Get through war and see, Agnes echoed with a smile. Let's go back into the pub for a pint. Are you staying very long or do you have to go right back? I have half hour, I think. We fly between German and Allied raids. Time for 1 pint. The time went quickly and Stan had to return to his plane. Vera was furious. Who was that? I'm guessing brother, cousin, former and still friendly boyfriend? Intimate, but not sexual. Agnes wasn't sure what to call Stan. Nearly brother-in-law came closest to what you think. I was seeing his brother Jan until, well, his last flight. Oh. This is a replica of his Polish Medal of Honor. It's all I have from him. She put her necklace back under her blouse. His brother Stan here is also a pilot. They flew together that first summer of the war. Stan seems to have a charmed life. I think you need each other, Vera observed, emotionally, if not romantically. I agree. So that's the 3 girls. So yeah, but that's the way I kind of put stories that I'd heard kind of blended together so that they would make some sense for the characters. So, it's been fun.
That is
Quite an
interesting.
undertaking.
Yeah, because I'm not a normal writer. I probably research something for about 2 or 3 weeks at a time, and then just, well, no, and then just zip out a chapter, and then research some more and zip out a chapter. I had no idea when I started writing where the book was going to go.
Really?
When did you start?
Oh, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe even longer.
It was just something to do
Yeah.
on the side when you had a chance.
Something to do on the side. Yeah.
Hmm.
But I'm not one of these people write 15 minutes a day or anything like that. Oh God, no.
Well, I love that you took the real history from people, the unusual things that happen, like the Spitfire with the beer and all that stuff. And some people say that someone was asked, well, what do you think is more unlikely, fact or fiction? And they said, well, facts are more unlikely because fiction has to follow a certain thing. So if you can take the facts and put them in,
Oh, yeah.
that's a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, I love that.
Yeah.
But I've also met some very wealthy English people who said, yeah, our parents wanted us to definitely have some basic survival skills, just in case, and so I thought of that and I thought, well, okay, yeah, if it happened in one family, it could probably happen in another. So, but I have them, yeah.
I came in a few minutes late, you may have already explained this. How did you, or why did you decide on these three main characters?
Like I said earlier, I couldn't make up my mind which one I liked the best, so I sort of gave them all as much equal time as I could in their own stories. There are places where they do interact by writing to each other. At one point, Agnes realizes that she and Maggie are obviously both on the front line in northern France, and she figures out a way of finding the press camp where Maggie is. And she arrives dressed as one of the British version of the USO, where she comes in all dressed up in a very odd costume. And she harasses the guard at the door to get in to see her. And so that's kind of fun. And together they track down a third person that they know very well. There were, I guess, maybe 3/4 of the way through, I knew bits and pieces had to be in the story, but I wasn't really sure how they were going to go together,
How you're gonna connect.
how they were going to connect. And then it just suddenly, there was something that worked. But yeah, I was not a traditional writer, but with the way I wrote it at all.
Were you getting any feedback from other writers while you were in the midst of this process? Because you have a definitely style, and you're handling plot, and you're handling theme, and you're handling character and dialogue and all of this. So did you have other writers at all giving you feedback?
At the beginning, yes, there was a writers group that was here before COVID. And it met, John Wah was in charge of that, or was leading that. And we would read aloud a chapter or
Was this
a
at the
piece at the
library?
library.
At the library?
Mhm. He's chosen not to continue doing that. And yeah, it finished off 2.5 years ago. Like so many things. But there was a lot of help there, both in grammar and in structure. But we were all working on very different things. There were a couple of people doing memoirs, some were doing fantasy fiction, some were doing science fiction, some people were doing straightforward fiction like I was.
Was John doing his noir?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And we all had our own styles. So it was very interesting just to be exposed to how we were all exploring this.
Do you think that was a necessary sort of impetus to sort of get you going, or get you in, like, kind of knowing how to go about it, how to or giving you some ideas to put the thing together from the beginning? I'm just curious.
It was more like a reader's, I think what Malia has described as the writer's work that you're planning to have people open mic. And so it really helped me focus on the idea of writing. I also, for a brief time, under a year, met with 2 other women, again, a memoir, a nonfiction, and a fiction. And what we did for each other was we set goals. Well, the next time we meet, have this much done. And so there was an outside discipline that was brought into it. And I think that helped bring some of the things. I think one of the funniest stories that I had, you want to make sure as much of, especially in historic fiction, you want to make sure that most of the details are pretty straightforward and will be accurate. And so for a whole day, I worked on cameras. Because if Maggie is going to be a journalist, what kind of cameras were they being used
Oh,
at that
okay.
time? And it took me about a day of research, but I found out that basically by World War II, they had the same small brownie cameras and basically like that we have now. And all you notice in my book is that a group of people are in a Jeep and he tossed his camera in the back seat. But I wanted to make sure that it wasn't, these giant glass plate kind of things that you see from ancient times. Wasn't really sure. And another thing was working on Ellie's story and trying to store food and supplies for wartime. Most people would use what? A basement. So we were in Leiden in the Netherlands, which is where Ellie lived. And we're taking a canal trip. And I said, gee, you probably have some pretty damp basements. Oh, we don't have any basements. What?
Uh-oh.
Because I also at that point was there's going to be a dead body involved, and I was going to bury the dead body in the basement.
Uh-oh.
Plan B. No basements.
But because of the water level and stuff.
Yeah. So, and that would have been, if it becomes a big bestseller in the Netherlands, that would be such a blooper that you just can't do that. Yeah. So they hid cans in some faux molding along the ceilings. And it worked out well because then as you remove the canned goods, you've got wood for your fire. So, that worked out. But there were a lot of little funny things like that had to be solved. But finding out about emergency medicine and forest camping medicine is how I found out about the tea and also tobacco can apparently be
Tobacco's been
used.
too. Tea is probably better, yeah.
I use both in parts of the book. And so that was kind of fun researching. That's kind of goofy stuff too.
Yeah.
Not goofy stuff, but now I know.
So you're going to have a sequel to this? Or
Oh, I don't
what's the
know.
next one?
I don't know. The one thing I think is really the biggest challenge has been self-publishing. And Iris, you know about that. And the book is very, very readily available through Amazon. The only other outlet for it is the actual publisher's bookstore. And I've been trying to get multiple copies for our bookstore and for other places, and they really aren't connected to some of these wholesalers the way a lot of books, which means that I have to act as a go-between or just book by book through Amazon. And this is just sort of a browsable women's book about World War II. And it's not going to be something that you go out of your way, unless you know me personally, but you're not going to go out of your way to find the book. But if it's on the shelf with all of the other books of that genre, you're going to pick it up. And so I think that has been my biggest snag. It has been the actual promoting and marketing of the book after the fact.
So as of today, where are the books available?
Right here on this table,
Okay, that's a good
or
place.
via Amazon. And I think if I'll bring these books over to the Lopez bookshop to be picked up after today.
Is it on the Kindle?
There's also an ebook available through Amazon. I hate supporting Jeff, but right now that's really the best way of getting it. So I've got my book submitted for a book reviewing service, and depending upon what they do with the review will make my determination whether or not I make a sequel or not. I have ideas for a sequel, but maybe in the 1950s, this group gets together and does something with Nazi looted art or forgeries or something like that in the 50s. But I really have to wait and see if it's going to be worth it all.
So there are, I mean, I don't know very much about self-publishing, but there are book review companies or organizations that you can submit your
Mhm.
book to and pay them probably,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
To have them review, and
Yeah.
that can end up being a way to, I mean, what happens to the reviews?
In most cases, in the two places that I've asked for reviews, you have control over the review. In some cases, if the review is not to your liking, you can just toss it. It won't be published anywhere unless you permit it to be. So, no news is good news in a way. If I don't like what I see, that's it.
And so if they were to publish it, where does it end up getting published?
Now, for example, there's a group in Bellingham called Chanticleer, and I've actually used their review right here on my book cover. The one that I've actually just recently paid for, and I won't hear for another month and a half, is through Kirkus. I figure they'll be, if they're really bad, then I'm out of here. But Kirkus is a real name dropper, and they have their own magazine as well, and it's a really a good selection tool for most libraries to use. It's a little bit higher end than Publishers Weekly. Yeah. Having been a librarian, I know these few places that would be the best bang for the buck as far as what review. If it's a good review from Kirkus, then I could write a new book and say, the old book got this review from Kirkus, and this is a follow-up book. So, I mean, it would be, and I might be able to break through and actually get a real publisher at that point if I've got a Kirkus review. I mean, that's what I'm looking at. And if it's a lousy review, then I know I'm done. But you can tell how brilliant it is. Yeah, they're delightful people. There's definitely some love interests in there. Andrew was who she was thinking of when she was climbing the tower. He was one of these very ego-driven hotshot pilots. He dies, but not because of his flying. And she goes on to somebody else who becomes the love of her life. And Agnes, as you get a subtle idea, was in love with this fellow named Jan. And when he came to England, he and his brother joined the Polish Air Force contingent together. And so while they were dating, she was basically dating both boys, both guys. And so just suddenly out of the blue, they see each other again. And things happen.
You always have to have a little romance.
Oh, yeah.
That's
oh,
life.
yeah.
There's always some romance.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy,
Well,
and
thank
thank
you.
you all for coming too.
I hope they'll be received.
Oh, thank you.
There are copies of the book here for sale.
Has anybody read the book already? Not yet? Okay.
I think if you do books on tape, you should read it on the screen.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so dyslexic.
Well, you had some friends there.
Hi.
Yeah, Diana and Ed and Ron and Sheila and John and Nancy Butte were there earlier, and Mary Bywater Cross and Nancy Searles.
So none of my faraway friends.
Hi. There was someone named Paula Dix. Is she local? Oh, you don't know her. Okay, well, she was on for a bit. But there.
Okay.